My deep gratitude to the deacons of the California-Nevada Conference and to Bishop Carcanio for this invitation. As you'll discover, I'm kind of passionate about the deacon as one of the answers for the challenges that the denomination finds itself in today. I have been asked to speak as part of your celebration of the 25th anniversary of the 1996 General Conference decision that created the Order of Deacon, two orders of ordained ministry, actually, deacons and elders, in approximately the form that continues today. Both orders took on fresh identities with that decision. It was a decision that reflected new thinking about the nature of ministry, the meaning of ordination, and the mission of the church. It was courageous and prophetic, and that's why we named this book Advancing the Mission. But it didn't spring full-blown from the head of Zeus. There was a long build-up. 1996 didn't happen in a vacuum. Three concepts were evolving and had been evolving for a while. First, the church's understanding of ministry, which had been limited to the work of clergy, and it was redefined as the work of all Christians. All of us are called to ministry by our baptism. Secondly, the church's understanding of ordination, which had been pretty much limited to the traditional idea of the pastor, was evolving to embrace setting apart leaders for all kinds of ministry, especially ministries focused on the transformation of the world. And third, the church's understanding of mission, which had been focused primarily on conversion of those who didn't know Jesus, and it claimed a wider vision of transforming the world in search of the reign of God. My favorite line in the discipline really captures this. The people of God, who are the church made visible in the world, must convince the world of the reality of the gospel or leave it unconvinced. Or maybe you're more familiar with paragraph 120. The mission of the church is to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. World War II had left Europe in shambles. Particularly Western Christianity recognized its failure to speak out in the face of Nazi atrocities. How could the church have responded more effectively? In the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, Protestants were beginning ecumenical conversations, and the World Council of Churches began more urgent discussions. How could they work together? What kind of leaders were needed? Bishop, elder, and deacon were discussed. The Catholic Council, known as Vatican II, was called at least partly in response to the same pressures. Vatican II affirmed the ordained deacon as a distinct order from the priesthood and began to reestablish it with the encouragement of Pope Paul VI. What I see as a really important first step toward the deacon was already present in the 1950s before the United Methodist Church existed. Both the Methodist Church and the Evangelical United Brethren were concerned about specialized church employees, such as educators and church musicians. Both denominations established processes for professional credentialing because they recognized how critical these leaders were. The church needed them. In 1968, as of course you know, the new United Methodist denomination was born. It continued those practices of its predecessor denominations of professional certification for people who were doing specialized ministries such as music or CE. In a highly significant move toward the deacon, the new UMC also instituted a consecrated lay worker. It was significantly lay, not ordained, and worker, not minister. But the lay worker was consecrated and broader in concept than those director positions. They were called in ministry, but not pastors. This happened amidst a lot of conversation about how ministry is the work of all of us, not just the pastor. And then, just 8 years later, the 76th General Conference affirmed that all Christian ministry is Christ's ministry of outreaching love. All Christians are called to this ministry. And that same General Conference, 1976, defined a new office with the task of helping the church be engaged in its mission, both in the local congregation and in the world. Paragraph 301 states, "Within the total church community, there are persons called of God and set apart through consecration for specialized ministries of service in the church's life and mission. These are consecrated diaconal ministers." The proposal couldn't quite bring itself to use the word deacon because that word was used for a probationary step on the way to becoming an elder. So they came up with the adjectival form of the word diaconal. But it was more than just a new name for that consecrated lay worker. They were to be called minister. The diaconal minister broadened and clarified the concept of the consecrated lay worker. The director of Christian education, director of church music, etc., were limited by a professionalization, but diaconal ministers were defined as called and set apart for a lifetime ministry of love, service, and justice in both church and world. For the next 20 years, repeated ministry study commissions asked the General Conference to make the diaconal ministry into an ordained office. But it was hotly resisted because it would mean departing from at least two traditions. One, the Methodist tradition of two-step ordination before full conference membership, was important to many people. However, I would remind you that this was a practice of the Methodist Church. The Evangelical United Brethren never did that. And the second departure from tradition, ordination had meant a commitment to itinerate and authorization for sacramental presidency. Can we ordain people who do not itinerate? Can we ordain without sacramental authority? The issue driving the conversation was the mission of the church. Do we need more than one kind of ordained leader? Of course we need pastoral leadership, but do we also need ordained leaders whose ministry is explicitly focused on convincing the world of the reality of the gospel? 16 years after the creation of the diaconal minister, something very dramatic happened. The 1992 General Conference received a report of its Legislative Committee on Ministry that proposed an ordained deacon. But the Council of Bishops had had a competing proposal to table the discussion and refer the whole matter to them. Eventually, when a vote was taken in a very dramatic moment, acceptance of the Legislative Committee's proposal and approval of a new deacon failed by only 2 votes. And several votes that would have been yes were seated on the platform, ready to speak to the legislation. But the platform was outside the bar of the conference. They could not vote. It failed by 2 votes, and if those on the platform could have gone to their seats and voted, it would have passed by at least 2. Diaconal ministers and others who saw this proposal as important for empowering missional leaders and making more effective the efforts to transform the world were devastated and angry. They felt tricked and silenced. But they had also learned a lot about the political processes of the General Conference, and they didn't give up. Between 1992 and 1996, those who believed strongly in the church's need for ordained leaders, focused on bringing the gospel to reality in the world, worked very hard. Meanwhile, the Council of Bishops held listening sessions around the church, and prepared their own proposal, which would partially move toward that goal. And in October of 1995, just 6 months before that 1996 General Conference would convene in Denver, diaconal ministers from all around the connection came to Atlanta for a convocation. Lots of them. Maybe half of all the diaconal ministers were there. Bishop Oden came to that convocation and told them what the bishops were proposing. Their proposal included an ordained deacon with conference membership, but continued the practice of first ordaining candidates intending to become elders as deacons, and then they would have a second ordination. But some could remain deacons. Diaconal ministers attending that convocation gathered that evening and expressed their concerns that this plan would create a very hierarchical system. Deacons would look like junior elders. It would not emphasize the mission of the church in its broadest understanding of extending into the world. So that night, Dr. Mary Elizabeth Moore, herself a diaconal minister and professor at Claremont School of Theology, agreed to chair a small group to propose amendments to the bishop's report to the 1996 General Conference. They called themselves a Diaconal Clearness Committee and began meeting immediately. They operated like a Clearness Committee, with periods of silence when they didn't know what to do, and then spurts of creativity would emerge. They ended up writing quite a bit of legislation to clarify and make stronger the bishop's proposal of an ordained deacon. That convocation had met in October. The Clearness Committee had to complete its legislation by January to meet the deadline for petitions to General Conference. Meanwhile, diaconal ministers had learned a lot from 1992 about how to organize, advocate, and work in the political system. In every conference, diaconal ministers began contacting their delegates and explaining their proposal. The Clearness Committee had proposed amendments to the bishop's ministry study rather than competing legislation. But their petitions eliminated two-step ordination for elders, created a new provisional period before ordination, and then full membership for deacons and elders. The Clearness Committee agreed to let sacraments remain only for elders, and the Legislative Committee agreed with all the amendments to the bishop's report that came from the Clearness Committee. Their work bore fruit. On Wednesday evening, April 24th, 1996, the Legislative Committee report was on the agenda for the plenary. It revised the process of ordination so it would begin with commissioning at the beginning of a provisional membership period of 3 years under appointment. And with successful navigation of that probationary period, a person could be ordained as a deacon or elder and become a full member of the annual conference. Both orders would have the right to vote on all matters of clergy membership. Deacons would be ordained to word and service. Elders would be ordained to word, service, sacrament, and order. We would no longer ordain elders twice, and it passed with 769 votes, a large majority. That's what we celebrate this year. In 2012, the General Conference added the words compassion and justice along with word and service as identifiers for deacons. And then elders would be ordained to word, service, sacrament, and order. Deacons would be ordained to word, service, compassion, and justice. Each order would have 4 words, and the focus of deacons became a bit clearer with that 2012 action. Interestingly, the ministry study documents that's been submitted for the 2020 General Conference, which of course hasn't happened yet, states, Deacons help the church love the world with the compassionate heart of Jesus and confront the powers of the world as they work toward justice. And the same document states that both deacons and elders, by virtue of their ordination, are connected to sacraments. The report is a strong affirmation of the ministry of deacons. And yet, deacons still struggle for recognition and are underutilized in the church. As a former General Secretary of the General Board of Higher Education and Ministry, Dr. Jerome King Del Pino told me, quote, "Everyone in their respective silos basically said, 'Deacons are not my problem.' Consequently, deacons have had to spend their life dealing with a system that did not really want them." Del Pino's correct. Too many deacons have had to spend way too much energy convincing the church that they should exist. I look closely at the movement from the 1950s to the present, and I see the three understandings that I named earlier have evolved significantly. Ministry. We are quite clear now that all Christians are called to ministry by their baptism. It's not the work of clergy only. But deacons have a role in leading and focusing the ministry of all of us because of their explicit call to address the needs and injustices of the world. As the latest ministry commission says, deacons help the church love the world with the compassionate heart of Jesus and confront the powers of the world and its injustice. Deacons embody their ordination to word, service, compassion, and justice in their ministries. Ordination. Boards of ministry and bishops have all expanded their definition of the work of deacons and elders. Deacons are engaged in so many kinds of ministry: teachers, lawyers, social workers, church music, youth ministry, community organizers, leaders of retreat centers and camps, chaplains in all sorts of settings, advocates, nurses, doctors, farmers, instructors of healing yoga, writers, librarians, spiritual directors, etc. Candidates for deacon, nevertheless, are still asked, why do you need to be ordained to do this? Of course, you don't need to be ordained to be a teacher or a nurse or a musician or a spiritual director. But God calls people to these forms of ministry, and it is qualitatively different to answer that call and offer your ministry as an agent of Jesus Christ and his church. The church needs these people leading the people of God in ministries that embody the reality of the gospel. And mission. We learned the hard way that our mission simply cannot remain in our buildings. As someone said during the pandemic, the church is not closed. The church has left the building. And who better to lead us than our deacons? The people of God, who are the church made visible in the world, must convince the world of the reality of the gospel or leave it unconvinced. The time is now. Deacons have so much to offer to the hurting world. The next 25 years will be exciting.